At exactly 5:45 in the morning, while most people on board were still asleep, a young woman stood alone in a quiet corner of a massive cruise ship, holding a phone. She looked distressed. Not panicked. Not screaming. Just off. Something wasn't right. A crew member approached her, asking if she was okay. And she said something chilling. Yeah, fine. But her body language said the complete opposite. She hung up the phone, pushed her hair back, placed her hands in her back pockets, and calmly walked away. That was the last confirmed moment anyone ever saw Rebecca Coriam alive. No struggle, no scream, no alarm, no evidence. Just gone. What makes this case even more disturbing is not just that she disappeared. It's where she disappeared from. A Disney cruise ship. A place marketed as one of the safest, most controlled environments in the world. A floating city surrounded by cameras, staff, security protocols, and strict operational systems. A place where, realistically, nothing should happen without someone noticing. And yet, somehow, a 24-year-old crew member vanished without a trace. No confirmed fall. No body. No explanation. And most unsettling of all, no clear answer from the very company responsible for her safety. Rebecca Coriam wasn't just another crew member. She was full of life. Energetic. Driven. The kind of person people naturally gravitated toward. Born in Chester, England, she grew up in a close-knit family that described her as cheerful, adventurous, and deeply caring. She had dreams. Real dreams. The kind that push you to leave home and chase something bigger. She studied sports science, worked with youth groups, even traveled to the United States to teach sports at Camp America. She loved working with kids. That mattered to her. So when the opportunity came to work with Disney Cruise Line as a youth worker, it felt like everything was falling into place. It was exciting. It was meaningful. It was exactly the kind of life she wanted. And for a while, it seemed perfect. She went through Disney training in Florida, learned the systems, understood the structure, and eventually began working on cruise routes across the Bahamas. Later, she was assigned to the Disney Wonder, a massive ship operating out of Los Angeles, sailing through the Mexican Riviera, visiting exotic ports, living what many would call a dream life. But like many things that look perfect from the outside, there were layers no one could see. Rebecca kept in close contact with her family. Messages, calls, Facebook, Skype. She wasn't distant. She wasn't withdrawing. She was connected, still very much part of her family's life. In fact, just one day before she disappeared, she sent her parents a message. A simple one. She told them she would call them the next day. That call never came. March 21st, 2011. The Disney Wonder departs Los Angeles. Rebecca is on board. Working, living, moving through her normal routine. Nothing officially flagged. Nothing recorded as unusual. At least not yet. But sometime during that night, something changed. We don't know exactly what. We don't know when. We don't know why. But by early morning, things were no longer normal. At 5:45 a.m., Rebecca appears on CCTV, standing in a crew area, on a phone, looking distressed. Not emotional in an obvious way, but clearly not okay. The kind of not okay that doesn't shout, but lingers. A crew member walks up, checks on her. She dismisses it. Yeah, fine. But she wasn't fine. Everyone who later saw the footage agreed on that. Something was wrong. And then she walked away. Just like that. No rush. No fear. No urgency. Just gone. A few hours later, something happened that triggered the alarm. Rebecca didn't show up for work. That alone was unusual. Crew members don't just skip shifts. Especially not someone like her. She was responsible, reliable, present. But now, she was nowhere to be found. They checked her cabin. Nothing. They called her name over the ship's announcement system. No response. They searched. Everywhere. Cabins. Crew areas. Restricted sections. Nothing. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Now here's where things become deeply unsettling. Because this isn't just any location. This is a cruise ship. A closed system. You cannot leave without being seen. You cannot disappear without crossing monitored areas. There are cameras. Access points. Controlled zones. Movement is tracked. And yet, there was no footage of her leaving the ship. No footage of her falling. No footage of anything happening to her. Just that one clip. 5:45 a.m. Phone call. Distress. Then nothing. At that point, the only logical conclusion was one thing. She went overboard. But even that didn't make sense. Because if someone falls off a ship, there's usually evidence. Witnesses. Sounds. Something. And more importantly, cameras. Cruise ships are heavily monitored, especially areas near railings, decks, and open sections. So if Rebecca had fallen or jumped, where was the footage? Where was the confirmation? Where was the proof? The official explanation began forming quickly. She may have been swept overboard by a wave. An accident. Tragic. Unavoidable. But something about that explanation didn't sit right. Not with her family. Not with people who knew the ship. And not with those who later started digging deeper into what really happened. Because when her parents arrived, things got even stranger. They weren't treated like grieving family members seeking answers. They were handled carefully, quietly, almost controlled. They were brought onto the ship through a side entrance, away from public view, after passengers had already disembarked. They weren't given full access. They weren't shown everything. They were told what happened, but not shown why. And that raised the first major question. What was Disney not showing? Because in a place filled with cameras, in a system built on control, in an environment where every movement can be tracked, how does someone disappear without a trace? And more importantly, why does the explanation feel incomplete? Because this wasn't just a disappearance. This was the beginning of a mystery that would only get darker. Once Rebecca Coriam was officially declared missing, the situation shifted from concern to urgency almost immediately. This wasn't a case where someone simply failed to check in or missed a shift. This was a controlled environment. A cruise ship is not like a city where someone can disappear into crowds, take different routes, or vanish into unmonitored spaces. Everything is structured, everything is tracked, and movement is contained within a closed system. That reality is what makes this case so unsettling. Because when someone disappears in a place like that, the expectation is simple. There should be answers. The crew began a full internal search of the ship. Every accessible area was checked. Cabins, storage rooms, staff quarters, recreational spaces, maintenance zones. Even areas passengers never see were inspected thoroughly. But there was nothing. No sign that Rebecca had been injured. No indication of a struggle. No personal items left in unusual places. Her absence wasn't just unexplained. It was clean. Too clean. At the same time, the situation escalated beyond the ship itself. External search efforts began in the surrounding waters. The United States Coast Guard was alerted, and the Mexican Navy joined the search as the ship had been traveling off the coast of Mexico. Helicopters scanned the ocean surface. Rescue vessels traced potential drift patterns based on currents and timing. These operations are designed for speed and precision because survival time in open water is extremely limited. But even with rapid response, the search yielded nothing. No debris, no clothing, no body, nothing that could confirm she had gone overboard. As hours turned into days, the lack of physical evidence became one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Because even in accidental overboard incidents, there are usually signs. A witness, a splash, a recorded fall, something that provides a starting point. But here, there was none. Just absence. 3 days later, when the Disney Wonder returned to Los Angeles, the formal investigation transitioned to the Royal Bahamas Police Force. This detail is critical because the ship was registered in the Bahamas, meaning jurisdiction fell under Bahamian authority rather than U.S. law enforcement. That alone created complications. A case involving a British citizen disappearing on a U.S.-operated cruise ship, investigated under Bahamian jurisdiction, immediately introduced limitations in coordination, resources, and transparency. A detective from the Royal Bahamas Police Force boarded the ship to investigate. On paper, this should have been a thorough process. Interviews, evidence collection, timeline reconstruction. But when Rebecca's parents later met with the investigator, what they heard did not reflect the seriousness of the case. According to them, the detective admitted he had only spent a short time on board and had interviewed only a small number of crew members. More concerning, he had not spoken to any passengers. That decision raised immediate questions. Cruise ships are filled with potential witnesses. People who might notice unusual behavior, hear something, see movement at odd hours. Ignoring that entire pool of information severely limits any investigation. It suggested either a lack of thoroughness or a controlled approach to what information was being collected. Rebecca's parents were flown to Los Angeles to meet the ship when it docked. They were grieving, confused, and desperate for answers. But instead of being treated as partners in understanding what happened, they were handled in a way that felt distant and controlled. They were brought onto the ship through a side entrance, away from public view, after all passengers had disembarked. They were not given full access to the environment where their daughter had disappeared. Everything they were told came through structured conversations, not open exploration. The explanation they received was simple. Rebecca had likely gone overboard, possibly an accident, possibly caused by environmental conditions. But when they asked for evidence, none was presented. No confirmed footage, no precise location, no detailed reconstruction of events. Just a theory. This is where the case begins to shift from mysterious to suspicious, because a cruise ship is one of the most surveilled environments in the world. Cameras cover hallways, decks, entrances, exits, and key operational areas. The idea that someone could fall overboard without being captured on camera raises serious questions. Either the footage exists and was not shared, or the system failed in a way that has never been clearly explained. Journalist John Ronson later took a personal interest in the case and decided to investigate independently. He boarded the Disney Wonder himself, retracing Rebecca's final known movements and speaking to crew members privately. What he found was not official information, but something more revealing: hesitation. Crew members were cautious. They avoided direct answers. But in quieter moments, they suggested something different from the official narrative. Some implied that the truth was known among staff. Not speculation, not guesses, but knowledge. One crew member told him, "Everything here is taped." That statement carries weight. If everything is recorded, then the absence of footage is not a lack of evidence. It is a missing piece of evidence. Ronson examined the physical areas where Rebecca might have gone overboard. The jogging track was one possibility. It had lower railings compared to other parts of the ship. In theory, someone could trip or lose balance. But that area was heavily monitored, and no footage has ever been released showing anything unusual. Then there was the crew pool area. This location came up repeatedly in conversations with crew members. Many insisted that Rebecca had gone overboard from there. They spoke about it as if it were widely accepted. But when Ronson saw the pool himself, the claim didn't make sense. The area was surrounded by high steel walls designed to prevent falls and block views over the edge. For someone to go overboard from that location, it wouldn't be accidental. It would require effort. Even more troubling was the discovery of flip-flops allegedly linked to the incident. Initially, they were suggested to belong to Rebecca and used to support the idea that she had been near the pool. But further investigation revealed they were not hers. They didn't match her size or style, and they had another crew member's name written on them. This revelation undermined a key piece of the narrative and raised a critical question. If this detail was incorrect, what else had been misrepresented? Another major point of concern was the phone call itself, the final recorded moment of Rebecca's life. According to multiple accounts, the call may have been recorded by the ship's internal system. If that is true, it could contain vital information. It could reveal what she was upset about, who she was speaking to, and whether her distress was personal or something more serious. But that recording has never been released publicly. It has never been described in detail. It simply exists as a possibility without confirmation. Rebecca's behavior that morning adds another layer to the mystery. She was not described as reckless or unstable. She was active, social, and engaged with her work and family. Her distress during the call suggests a trigger, something specific that caused a change in her emotional state. But without knowing what that trigger was, the context is missing. As investigators and independent observers looked deeper, inconsistencies continued to emerge. The timeline remained unclear. The physical evidence was either absent or questionable. The explanations provided were not supported by verifiable proof. And perhaps most concerning, the level of transparency expected in such a case was simply not there. At this stage, the case was no longer just about a disappearance. It had become a puzzle filled with gaps, a situation where every answer created new questions. And as those questions grew, so did the possibility that what happened to Rebecca Coriam was not as simple as an accident at sea. Because when a person disappears in a place where everything is monitored, controlled, and recorded, the absence of answers is not just unusual. It is significant. It suggests that somewhere within that system, there is information that has not been fully revealed. And until that information is brought to light, The truth behind Rebecca Coriam's disappearance remains hidden beneath layers of uncertainty, speculation, and silence. By this point, the case of Rebecca Coriam had moved beyond a simple missing person investigation and into something far more complex. Because when a disappearance leaves behind no physical evidence, no confirmed timeline, and no clear explanation, what fills that gap are theories. And in this case, the theories are not just numerous, they are deeply conflicting, each one raising as many questions as it attempts to answer. And the more you examine them, the more you begin to realize that none of them fully explain what happened, which is exactly why this case continues to disturb people years later, because it doesn't settle into a single narrative. It resists it, it challenges it, and it leaves behind a sense that something important is missing. The first and most widely accepted theory is the official one, that Rebecca Coriam went overboard, either by accident or as a result of environmental conditions. And on the surface, this seems like the simplest explanation, because statistically, overboard incidents do happen on cruise ships, and in many cases, they are never witnessed directly. But the problem here is not the possibility of an overboard incident. The problem is the lack of evidence supporting it in this specific case, because, for that theory to hold weight, certain conditions must be met. There should be a location where the fall could occur, there should be a reason she was there, and there should ideally be some form of supporting evidence, whether that is witness testimony, camera footage, or physical signs. But in Rebecca's case, none of those elements are clearly established. The areas suggested as possible points where she could have gone overboard do not align with the narrative as cleanly as one would expect. The jogging track, while theoretically possible, was monitored, and no footage has ever been released showing her presence there after the phone call. The crew pool, which many staff members insisted was the location, presents even more contradictions, because the design of that area makes accidental falls extremely unlikely, with high steel barriers surrounding the space, blocking any easy path overboard. And even if one were to argue that extreme weather conditions played a role, independent analysis later suggested that the sea conditions at the time were not severe enough to support the idea of a wave powerful enough to sweep someone over such barriers without causing noticeable damage or disturbance. This leads to the next version of the overboard theory, which is that Rebecca may have intentionally climbed or placed herself in a risky position, possibly sitting on a ledge or wall, and then lost balance. But again, this requires assumptions about her behavior that are not strongly supported by her personality or known state of mind. Because while she appeared distressed during the phone call, there is no evidence that she was acting irrationally, recklessly, or in a way that would suggest she was engaging in dangerous behavior, and her family strongly rejected the idea that she would have knowingly put herself in a situation where she could fall. Then there is the theory of suicide, which in many missing person cases is considered when there is emotional distress involved, and at first glance, her behavior on the phone could be interpreted as someone dealing with something serious, possibly personal, possibly overwhelming. But when you look deeper, this theory becomes difficult to sustain, because Rebecca's life, as described by her family and friends, did not show signs of someone planning to end it. She had future plans, she was in regular contact with her family. She had even arranged passes for her loved ones to visit Disneyland Paris, something that indicates forward thinking, planning, and a desire to share experiences, not withdraw from them. Additionally, suicide in such an environment would likely involve some form of preparation or indication, especially in a setting where movement is monitored and access points are limited. And yet there was no evidence of her heading toward a specific area with intent, no note, no message, no final communication that would suggest she was planning to end her life, and perhaps most importantly, there was no confirmed footage of her going overboard, which would be expected in a scenario where someone deliberately places themselves in that position. As these two theories began to show weaknesses, a more unsettling possibility started to gain attention: the idea that Rebecca's disappearance involved foul play. And this is where the case becomes significantly darker, because foul play introduces intent, involvement of others, and the possibility that what happened was not an accident, but an event that someone wanted to hide. There are several elements that support this line of thinking, the first being her emotional state during the phone call. She was not just casually speaking, she appeared distressed, and distress often comes from interaction, from something that is happening between people, not just internal thoughts. And if the call was indeed with another person connected to the ship, whether a colleague, a friend, or someone else, then that interaction becomes critical to understanding what happened next. There were also reports suggesting that Rebecca may have been involved in a complicated personal relationship on board, possibly involving emotional conflict. And while this alone does not indicate danger, it introduces the possibility of confrontation, argument, or escalation, especially in an environment where people live and work in close quarters, under stress, with limited personal space and constant interaction. And if something did happen between her and another individual, whether intentional or accidental, it raises the question of how such an incident would be handled in a closed system like a cruise ship. Another point that fuels suspicion is the lack of transparency regarding available evidence, particularly CCTV footage, because multiple crew members indicated that the ship was heavily monitored and that most areas, especially those near the edges of the ship, were covered by cameras, and yet no footage showing her final movements beyond the phone call has ever been publicly released, which leads to two possibilities. Either the footage does not exist, which contradicts the statements about surveillance coverage, or it does exist and has not been disclosed, which raises serious concerns about why. The possibility of a cover-up has been suggested by several individuals connected to the case, including investigators and advocates who have worked on similar incidents involving cruise ships. And while the term cover-up can be easily dismissed without evidence, the pattern of limited information, controlled access, and lack of detailed reporting does create an environment where such suspicions can grow. Because when information is withheld or unclear, people naturally begin to question what is being hidden. One of the strongest arguments against the official narrative comes from independent investigators who analyzed the environmental conditions at the time of Rebecca's disappearance. They concluded that the sea was relatively calm, not extreme, not capable of producing the kind of wave that would be needed to lift someone over high barriers without leaving any trace. And this directly contradicts the idea that she was swept overboard by a rogue wave, weakening one of the key explanations provided. Early in the case, there is also the issue of the flip-flops, initially presented as potential evidence linking her to the crew pool area, but later proven not to belong to her. And this detail, while seemingly small, has significant implications because it suggests that evidence was either incorrectly identified or misrepresented. And if that can happen with something as basic as personal belongings, it raises concerns about the accuracy of other conclusions drawn during the investigation. Another theory, though less widely accepted, is that Rebecca may have left the ship intentionally and started a new life. But this is extremely unlikely given the circumstances. Leaving a cruise ship undetected is almost impossible without assistance. And even if it were possible, it would require planning, resources, and a clear motive, none of which have been established in her case. And there has been no confirmed sighting of her since her disappearance, making this theory more speculative than realistic. What makes this case particularly difficult is that each theory, when examined individually, contains gaps, contradictions, or missing elements. None of them fully align with the known facts, and none of them provide a complete explanation that satisfies all aspects of the case. And this is what keeps the mystery alive, because the truth, whatever it is, does not seem to fit neatly into any of the existing narratives. The deeper you look, the more the case begins to feel less like a mystery waiting to be solved and more like a story where key pieces have been removed, where the available information is not enough to form a complete picture, and where the answers may exist but are not accessible. And that realization is what makes the disappearance of Rebecca Coriam so unsettling, because it suggests that what happened to her is not just unknown, but possibly known and withheld. And that brings us to the most disturbing question of all, not what happened to Rebecca Coriam, but whether the full truth about her disappearance is being deliberately kept out of reach. Because in a place where everything is recorded, everything is monitored, and everything is controlled, the absence of answers is not just unusual, it is meaningful. It is a silence that carries weight. And until that silence is broken, the case remains unresolved, not just in fact, but in understanding, leaving behind a story that continues to raise questions long after the moment she walked away from that phone call and disappeared into uncertainty. By the time the investigation slowed down, something had already changed about this case. It was no longer just about finding Rebecca Coriam. It had become about something deeper, something harder to confront. The possibility that the truth was not missing, but hidden. Because when you step back and look at everything together, a pattern starts to form. Not a clear answer, but a pattern of absence. Missing footage, missing clarity, missing accountability. And in cases like this, what's missing often tells you more than what's present. Rebecca didn't just disappear from a random place. She disappeared from one of the most controlled environments on Earth. A cruise ship operated by one of the biggest entertainment companies in the world. A place designed around safety, surveillance, and structure. And yet somehow, none of those systems produced a clear answer. Think about that for a moment. A modern cruise ship is not just a vessel. It is a floating network. Cameras covering key areas. Security monitoring movement. Staff trained to respond to incidents. Every deck, every corridor, every open space accounted for. So if something happened to Rebecca, it should exist somewhere in that system. But it doesn't. Or at least, it hasn't been shown. And that silence is what has kept this case alive for so many years. Because silence creates space. And in that space, questions grow. Why was there no clear footage beyond the phone call? Why were key areas not fully accounted for? Why did multiple crew members suggest that more was known? While official reports remain vague, at some point, this stops feeling like an unsolved mystery and starts feeling like an incomplete story. Rebecca's family never accepted the official explanation, not because they wanted to believe something else, but because the explanation they were given didn't answer the most important questions. They remembered who she was, her personality, her plans, her energy. She wasn't someone who simply gave up. She wasn't someone who would disappear without leaving something behind. And she certainly wasn't someone who would vanish without a trace. In a place where traces should exist. Over time, they began to push harder. Ask more questions. Look deeper. Because when answers are limited, you start searching for what's missing. And what they found only made things more complicated. There were claims that additional footage existed, that more recordings had been reviewed, that certain areas of the ship were monitored in ways not publicly discussed. But none of that was confirmed in a way that provided closure. At the same time, independent voices began raising concerns about how cruise ship incidents are handled. Because Rebecca's case wasn't completely unique. There had been other disappearances, other incidents, other people who had gone missing at sea, with very little resolution. And that raises a larger question, not just about Rebecca, but about the system itself. Who is responsible when something happens in international waters? Who investigates? Who controls the information? And most importantly, who decides what the public gets to know? Because in this case, those lines were blurred. The ship was operated by an American company, registered in the Bahamas, carrying passengers and crew from multiple countries, which means responsibility was shared, and in some ways, diffused. And when responsibility is unclear, accountability becomes difficult. That's what makes this case so unsettling. It's not just the disappearance. It's the environment in which it happened. A place where everything should be documented. Everything should be explainable. Everything should be traceable. And yet, nothing was. Some investigators began to lean toward a darker possibility. Not just accident, not just misfortune, but involvement. Human involvement. Because when physical explanations fail, behavior becomes the focus. Rebecca was distressed during her final moments. That much is undeniable. But distress doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from something. A situation, a conversation, a conflict. And whatever caused that distress happened just hours before she disappeared. So the question becomes, what changed? What happened between that phone call and the moment she was gone? Was she alone? Or was someone with her? Did she go somewhere voluntarily? Or was she led there? Did something happen suddenly? Or was it building over time? These are the questions that remain unanswered. And they are the questions that matter most. Because without them, the case doesn't make sense. There were also reports of a possible relationship. Something complicated. Something emotional. And while that alone doesn't explain a disappearance, it introduces the possibility of tension, conflict, unpredictability. In a closed environment like a cruise ship, those dynamics can become amplified. There's nowhere to go, no real escape. Everything happens in proximity. And if something did escalate, if something went wrong, it wouldn't take much for a situation to spiral. That doesn't prove anything, but it changes the context. It shifts the focus from accident to possibility. Another theory suggested that Rebecca may have gone to the crew pool to be alone, to think, to calm down. That was a place she was known to visit, a place away from passengers, away from pressure. But even that theory has gaps, because the physical structure of that area doesn't support an easy fall, and the lack of evidence doesn't support a clear incident. So again, we return to the same problem. Nothing fully explains what happened. And when no theory fits completely, you're left with something uncomfortable. Uncertainty. Rebecca's parents never stopped searching for answers. They pushed for more transparency, more investigation, more accountability, not because they expected an easy answer, but because they believed one existed. Somewhere. They wanted access to the full report. They wanted clarity on the evidence. They wanted to understand what had been seen and what had not. But those answers never came in a complete form. And over time, the case began to settle into something else. A mystery that lingers. A story that remains unfinished. Because without evidence, without confirmation, without closure, all that remains is the question, what really happened to Rebecca Coriam? Did she fall? Did she jump? Did something happen that no one has revealed? Or is the truth sitting somewhere, recorded, known, but never shared? Because if there is one thing this case has shown, it's that not all mysteries are created equal. Some are unsolved because they are complicated. Some are unsolved because they lack evidence. And some feel unsolved because something is missing, something important. And until that missing piece is found or revealed, Rebecca's story remains suspended in that moment. 5:45 a.m. A quiet area. A phone call. A look of distress. A simple response. Yeah, fine. And then, nothing. No goodbye. No explanation. No trace. Just silence. And sometimes, silence says more than anything else.